What do you think?
We can try that.
All right.
I wanted to open by reminding you, Jim, of a panel we were on 20 years ago at Philcon.
Oh, Jesus.
And this panel was on the 60s. Sorry, I have an interruption here. This panel was on the 60s.
Hi, Patrick.
So we started telling all of our sex, drugs, rock and roll, and inappropriate public nudity stories. And toward the end, we were like telling the stories at the beginning we were too discreet to tell. And all the while that we were talking, in the back row there was this sweet, white-haired, old grandmotherly lady, and she was sitting there smiling gently to herself and knitting. And we came to the end of the panel, and we asked her questions, and she raised her hand. She said, "I just wanted to thank you boys for bringing back so many lovely memories." So, Jim, now that we're old and wise, what have we learned?
We learned that you need to start foreshadowing in the first paragraph. We learned that you should read your contracts very carefully. So, yeah, well, let's talk about the olden days, because one of the things I've always wondered is, I thought actually that you and I had, but this may be wrong, so we can find out, had very similar ideas of where our careers were going to go when we first came up. Now, of course, those ideas diverged since, but who did you think you were going to be when you grew up, when you were a young writer?
Brian Aldiss.
And why? What was about his career that...
Well, it wasn't his career, it was his writing. I loved his writing so much. His stories were so beautiful and so original. His novels were so varied. It really didn't matter to me that he wasn't making a fraction of the money that he deserved to make. Mm-hmm. And so I have had his career.
The poor old man, he's wondering where it went.
With the exception of he wrote that big blockbuster trilogy toward the end. Yeah, the Heliconian books, which they were not his best, but they made the most money.
That's interesting, because I would say, when I was a young writer, and of course, those who know my career will say you had nothing like this career, but I was most interested in having Bob Silverberg's career. Now, of course, Bob Silverberg is like 1,000 times more prolific than I was. But one of the things I always liked about Bob's career was that, first of all, he was literarily ambitious. Second of all, that he wrote novels and short stories continually, as you more than I, but nonetheless, did not just abandon the short story for the novel. No. And the other thing about Bob's career, though, that I only came to recognize later, because when I was first became a Bob Silverberg fan, he was in his prime. These were the glory years of Silverberg. Sort of stood astride the field as a colossus, as a literary writer who was also pleasing the fans. He was winning Nebulas but he was also, and Hugo's, but he was also like writing exquisitely wonderful things. But the thing about Bob that in retrospect our careers were similar was that Bob served his apprenticeship in print. He published a lot of bad stories when he started out, and so did I, as a matter of fact. And so, I mean, I published 90 some odd stories, and I wouldn't commend any of my first 10 stories to your attention. As a matter of fact, they've never been reprinted in any of my books, and they probably never will. I mean, they were published in very respectable zines, Asimov, well, not Asimov, so FNSF and Galaxy, and Terry Carr bought one for Universe, but I hate those stories. I mean, and your early stories are pretty good.
My first two published stories made it onto the Nebula ballot.
Jerk.
They were up against each other. That got me a lot of attention, and I liked that.
Okay, so how did you get two stories? I mean, did you start writing these stories right away, and the first two stories out of your head were this good, or are there other ones that we will never see and should never see that exist in some drawer or in a locked file someplace?
I dedicated my life to writing fiction when I was 17. And I wrote and wrote and wrote And 12 years later, I finally finished a story. I was writing stories that I couldn't finish. I couldn't figure out how to turn it into a story. And then finally I wrote a story called, well, it doesn't matter what it was called because I...
It's forgettable.
It's forgettable. I finally finished writing I finally, Gardner Does Law knew that I was a gonna-be writer. And I impressed him favorably because I never tried to get him to look at my stories. And after a while, it began to bug him that he had no idea whether I was any good or not. So he asked to see what I was working on. And he took the story, and Jack Inn came to visit, and I dropped by Gardner's apartment, and Jack and Gardner took the story apart and showed me how to finish it. And I said, oh, that's how you finish a story. And I went home that night just reeling on bad cream sherry and the knowledge that I was now a writer. Yeah. And I finished that story, and it was like God reached down and flipped a light switch. And from that point on, I could always write stories.
So, and so that year, that would have been what year?
1979.
Okay, and so when you say you started when you were 17, so what year would that have been? Just
12 years before.
Okay, so here's the deal. I don't know if you agree with this, but there's a
67.
Very interesting research and some popularization of this notion that it takes about 10 years to master an art. And so that means from the day you start taking it seriously to the day you get to where you are yourself, or the self you're going to be as an artist, we sometimes summarize this as saying you have to write 100,000 words of crap or 1,000,000 words of crap. But I think it's actually about 10 years of finding out how to do what you're setting out to do. And so you did it in 12. I started in college when probably 1971, I started doing it seriously. And I don't think I get good till maybe 1980. Those 10 stories that are in there, even though some of them are not bad, they're not me. They're not the story. They're not the Jim Kelly you would like to read. And so I mean, art careers sort of have that in it, that about 10 years it took to do what needed to be done.
Well, let's try a different origin myth here.
Okay, yeah.
John Gardner